There are paintings that feel like beautiful objects. And then there are paintings that feel like evidence. This one just doesn't glow, it testifies. A woman sits in gold, composed, luminous, untouched at first glance. For decades, Austria held her up as a masterpiece, a national treasure, a jewel of cultural pride. But beneath all that shimmer was a harder truth. Because this portrait did not simply survive history, it was taken through it. And then, years later, a woman stepped forward and said in essence, "That painting is my family, and your museum has been hanging stolen memory on the wall." Welcome to Art Happens, the divine mess of art history, presented by J Squared Atelier. I'm James William Moore, your chaotic docent through art history. And this is Art History Mystery, where we take one artwork, one object, one supposedly settled story, and follow the trail it leaves behind. Receipts, secrets, politics, ghosts, all of it. Today, Gustav Klimt's Golden Portrait, the painting many people know as Woman in Gold. A masterpiece, yes, but also a legal battle, a moral reckoning, and a reminder that museums do not always inherit beauty cleanly. Let's start in Vienna, early 20th century, a city of elegance, performance, contradiction, coffee houses buzzing with ideas, music in the air, culture with the confidence to believe it might last forever. And into the atmosphere walks Gustav Klimt, an artist who understood that portraiture could be more than likeness. He didn't just paint people, he staged them. He transformed them. He wrapped them in symbol, seduction, and surface. Then comes Adele Bloch-Bauer, a wealthy Jewish patron, a woman from a prominent Viennese family, cultivated, intellectual, socially significant, the kind of figure history loves to flatten into elegance. But Klimt does something stranger than simply flattery. He paints her almost like an apparition. Her face is calm, but the body seems to dissolve into pattern. Gold leaf surrounds her. Decoration swallows space until Adele becomes both person and icon. She is there and not there. A woman, yes, but also image, surface, myth. Klimt's portrait is dazzling because it flirts with the sacred. It feels like part altar, part fashion, part dream. It is luxurious in a way that almost dares you not to ask questions. And that is part of the power of the painting. Because beauty can distract. Beauty can seduce. Beauty can make people forget that every image comes from a real world, with real money, real bodies, real politics, real consequences. And in Adele's portrait, the world around her was already more unstable than all that gold wanted to admit. Because history as we know it has no respect for elegance. Then comes 1938. Nazi Germany annexes Austria. And suddenly the glamorous world that produced this painting is no longer just refined or cultured or cosmopolitan. It is vulnerable, it is compromised. And for Jewish families, it becomes dangerous with terrifying speed. The Bloch-Bauers were one of many families targeted by the Nazi regime. Property was seized, assets were stripped away, collections were broken apart. And when we say art was taken, we should be careful not to make that sound administrative or abstract. This was not some neutral transfer of ownership. This was theft under persecution, looting through terror, a bureaucracy of violence. Because when a regime tries to erase a people, it does not just attack their bodies, it attacks their names, their homes, their records, their heirlooms, their proof of belonging. Art becomes more than decoration in that context. It becomes evidence that a family lived richly in the world, that they had history, that they had occupied cultural space, that they mattered. And that is exactly why such objects become targets. The Klimt portrait, along with other works from the Bloch-Bauer collection, was absorbed into the machinery of dispossession. After the war, the painting did not simply glide back into the hands of the family it had been taken from. Instead, it entered Austrian museum culture and national identity. Displayed, admired, protected, claimed. For decades, visitors encountered it as a triumph of Austrian modernism, a treasure of the nation, a jewel in the museum crown. And that is where the story becomes especially chilling, because the painting was not hidden, it was celebrated, hung in public view with all of the confidence of legitimacy, while the violence that enabled that display was softened, blurred, or buried beneath the language of heritage. So people looked at the gold and saw national pride. But under that gold was another sentence entirely. Look at what was taken. Look at who had to disappear for this wall label to feel so clean. Enter Maria Altmann, Adele Bloch-Bauer's niece, a refugee, a woman living in the United States. Not a museum insider, not a head of state, not some larger-than-life art world power broker, just someone carrying memory. And memory, let me tell you, can be deeply inconvenient to institutions that prefer polished stories. By the late 1990s, pressure around Nazi-looted art was growing. Archives were opening, questions were surfacing. The art world slowly, unevenly, reluctantly was being asked to account for itself. And Maria Altmann decided to fight for what had been taken from her family. Not just because the painting was valuable, though yes, obviously it was, but because value is not the same thing as meaning. This was about truth, inheritance, historical honesty, the right to say that public masterpieces you've turned into national mythology came to you through atrocity. And then the case grows, because Austria argues that it cannot simply be sued in American courts. So suddenly this is no longer only a dispute over paintings. It becomes a fundamental legal question. Can a sovereign nation shield itself behind immunity when the subject at hand is stolen history? Now, that is a hell of an art history twist. This battle eventually reaches the United States Supreme Court. Think about it. A portrait by Klimt, ornate, silent, decorative on the surface, becomes the center of a legal confrontation over memory, ownership, and accountability across nations. That alone should tell us something important. Art is never only aesthetic. Sometimes it sits quietly until someone forces the room to admit what it knows. Maria Altmann persisted, and eventually the case moved into arbitration in Austria. Then, in 2006, the decision came down. Austria had to return 5 Klimt paintings to their heirs of the Bloch-Bauer family. And just like that, the official framing cracked. Because a painting that had long been presented as a beloved national possession was publicly and formally recognized for what it had always been in this context: property taken through Nazi persecution. Not ambiguous, not unfortunate, not a complicated mix-up of history. Stolen. And once that word enters the room, everything changes. Because then the painting is no longer just beautiful, it is indicted beauty. Now here's the part that matters most to me. The painting was returned. But return does not equal restoration. Restitution is important, necessary. moral. But restitution is not magic. It does not bring back the dead. It does not undo exile. It does not erase fear, dispossession, humiliation, or generational rupture. It does not rebuild the world that existed before the theft. Restitution is not time travel. It is accountability. And accountability is often less cinematic than people want it to be. It is paperwork, evidence, dispute, delay, exhaustion. One person refusing to let the story stay neat. After the paintings were returned, the most famous of them, Adele's golden portrait, was eventually sold. Today, it lives in New York at the New Gallery. And that part matters too. Because the answer here was never hide the painting away. The answer was tell the truth about it. Change the label, change the story, change the moral conditions under which the public is allowed to admire it. Because the real shift is not simply location, it is interpretation. Before, the painting could be framed as an Austrian masterpiece, full stop. Now, it must also be understood as an object that moved through theft, displacement, and restitution. A work of art, yes, but also a witness, a survivor, a record of interrupted family life. And when you know that, the gold changes. It still dazzles, it still seduces, and now it flickers a little differently. It starts to feel less like glamour and more like a warning. So here is the real mystery underneath the mystery. When a museum says this belongs to the public, which public are they talking about? The public that benefits from the display? Or the public whose losses made the display possible? Because culture is not neutral. Museums are not neutral. Collections are not neutral. Objects do not float into institutions untouched by power. They are bought, inherited, traded, seized, donated, laundered through prestige, and sometimes protected by stories that are cleaner than the facts. And that is why restitution matters far beyond any single painting. It forces the art world to admit something profoundly uncomfortable, that some of its most cherished masterpieces are not just treasures. They are also sites of injury, crime scenes with excellent lighting. And that line may sound sharp, but it's true. Because museums often know how to preserve surface better than they know how to confess origin. The Klimt portrait asks us to do both, to admire the extraordinary achievement of the work, and to stay morally awake inside that admiration. To understand that beauty does not cancel theft. That fame does not cleanse violence. That cultural value does not erase historical debt. And maybe that is the deeper lesson here. Not that art is corrupted by history, but that art has always been in history. And history, messy as ever, keeps asking whether we are willing to look past the shine. Klimt's portrait is still radiant, still hypnotic, still one of the most recognizable paintings in modern art. But now if we're paying attention, it becomes something else too. A mirror, a challenge, a reminder that sometimes the frame does not simply hold an image. Sometimes it holds a century of theft, silence, and unpaid moral debt. And sometimes justice, late, incomplete, imperfect justice, is simply the moment when the wall label finally stops lying. Thanks for spending this time with me on Art Happens, the divine mess of art history, presented by J Squared Atelier. I'm James William Moore, your chaotic docent through art history. If you enjoyed this episode, follow the show wherever you listen. Until next time, keep looking closer, because in art, the truth is almost never just in the image. It's in who got to keep it and who had to fight to get it back.